Photographs are global stories, personal stories, timelines of humanity recorded for prosperity. And today, as we all know, everyone is a photographer. Everyone can have access to a smartphone. But exceptional photos have the power to take the viewer's mind to the scene and let them be a part of it. They have the power to evoke change for the good and at times, as we know, for evil. Not everyone may know the names of some photographers, but there are images that we all know that stick in the mind. For example, Nick Ute's picture of a naked young girl running down a road away from napalm during the Vietnam War. Annie Leibovitz's absolutely amazing picture of Demi Moore, heavily pregnant, naked on the cover of Vanity Fair magazine. The Rising of the American Flag on Iwo Jima by Joe Rosenthal, and the mesmerizing portrait of the Afghan girl with green eyes that appeared on the cover of National Geographic by Steve Curry. Today's theme is very topical. Given the global crisis of the COVID pandemic, our panel, all award-winning photographers, will discuss what motivated them to create their unique stories and discuss the challenges that it presented while shooting them amidst the pandemic that has held the world to ransom for, I think, far too long. We here in London are on our third lockdown, and I don't know what it's like not to be able to go to a restaurant or go to a gallery anymore. And as importantly, what I'm going to be asking our esteemed panelists is what they learned about themselves. Today, we're going to have Julia Fullerton-Batten and what she describes as hyperrealism and cinematic characteristics of her images. They are set in surreal settings with dramatic lighting, communicating simultaneously tension and mystery. Julia's most recent award, 2020, include the International Center of Photography in New York, a Lucy Trophy, Photo Vogue Festival 2020, all related to her powerful series during this pandemic, which she's still working on, called Looking Out from Within. Fabio is a photographer, journalist, author, known for his documentation of conflicts and the humanitarian consequences of war. He has spent the last decade covering the world's major changing events, creating images which reflect his commitment and, as importantly, empathy for the story. Fabio has won some of the most prestigious awards in the profession, including the Robert Capa Gold Medal, World Press Photo, Papillon's Visa d'Or, and POYE Photographer of the Year, and recently the Lucy Impact Award. The title of his, I don't know if I've got this right, Fabio, please forgive me. I've written down COVID-19 First Wave Coverage, Italy 2020, and in parentheses, we take the dead from morning till night. Alys Tomlinson is an editorial and fine art documentary photographer based in London. She recently won first prize in the coveted National Portrait Gallery Award, the Taylor Wessing, and last summer with a series called Last Summer. She was also named Sony Photographer of the Year in 2018 for a long-term project called X Photo. What she will be discussing today is Lost Summer. Ismail hails from Dhaka, Bangladesh, is that correct? Ismail? And he is a documentary photographer covering social humanitarian issues. Recently, his project, whilst the COVID pandemic was waging, was another rage. It was a rage about Black Lives Matter. And he covered those as, I think, someone that can be empathetic to a cause like that. Beyond that, he also created most chilling expose of a documentary before the COVID began, which I'd love for you to tell us a little bit about it later on, of the Rana Plaza factory collapse. It was probably the worst industrial disaster in history. He was the winner of the Manuel Rivera Altus Foundation for Documentary Photography and awarded first prize Professional General News category for the Prix de la Photographie. I know everybody's going to be anxious after they listen to everyone's talk and want to ask questions and be filled with energy and so on. And since anyone that knows me well, they know I am absolutely a pile of rubbish when it comes to techno stuff. So it'll be easy for me to be able to manage all of this for the Frontline Club, is if you folks would be kind enough to give me some patience, and whatever questions you have at the end of the time that everyone has a talk, we'll be able to pick and choose. And if I fall on my face, Panvera promises to jump in and help me out. Julia, can you please kick off the conversation by sharing with us your inspiration for the series, your challenges, and where you are in the development of now? Also, I'd be very interested of how you infuse in the series your very unique fantasy cine style, it's my words, with these images, which are with real people, very documentary, very stylized, and finally, what you've learned about yourself. Julia?
Thanks, Carol. Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to talk and amongst an amazing panelists. Where do I begin? I think it's nearly a year ago now that we learned about COVID, probably longer than a year. And as a photographer, my work dried up. I couldn't go out and shoot anymore like everybody else. And I just suddenly thought, what am I going to do? And to begin with, I started taking pictures of just random people in the street, because at that time, wearing masks was very, very unusual for us. I mean, to begin with, we used to see masks, people wearing masks in China and Japan, but never really in London. And when people started appearing wearing masks and gloves, I was approaching people on the street and I was kind of asking them if I could take pictures of them. And then I thought, well, that's not really quite my style. So then I put an ad out in my local neighborhood and asked who wanted to come forward to be photographed in their own homes, which was much easier for me to go to their homes. And therefore, kind of, my style is very cinematic, it's very staged, and I felt that was more suitable for my style of photography. So if I just share my screen for a second. So I live in West London, and as I mentioned, I put an ad out in my local area, and so many people came forward. It was unbelievable that I had a huge choice of people to photograph. And to begin with, I just shot everybody that came forward. And then I became a little bit more selective because there was such a wide choice. And it was, and still is, such a difficult time in our lives that I felt I really had to record in one way or another this time. And so I asked people to connect with them via email or by phone, and then for them to stand behind their windows, and I would still direct them. So it was very much still my style, which is, as I mentioned, quite cinematic, quite staged, but people in their own homes. And kind of what I realized was that people were looking quite forlornly out of their windows when walking down the London streets, which were now completely empty, and it was just incredibly surreal. And I turned up at their houses and I did a lot of research beforehand. Like, I would visit their homes 3 or 4 times, choose the window that I thought was suitable. I discussed with them their wardrobe, what they're going to wear. And as time went on, I became more elaborate with my style, which is more my style of photography. And that is, I would dress them, I would hire clothes or buy clothes on the internet and bring props. So even though they are actually in their own homes, I'm still kind of dressing them and staging them in a way. After a while, I realized that I was missing some really interesting locations. And I started putting letters through people's letterboxes if I found their homes were quite interesting. So this is one example of Anne, which was lockdown day 74. And I had no idea what she looked like. And I just put a letter through a letterbox, and out of probably 30 people, only 2 people came forward. And I met her and met her husband, and we organized a shoot from a distance. You know, I knocked on her door and we stood at a distance. And I realized also it helped shooting at twilight, because when it was getting darker, the insides were illuminating in the rooms, and the street lights were kind of taking over the atmosphere and help illuminating the the area that I was shooting. And that really helped with my style of photography. I also dragged my my son, who was 12 at the time, he's 13 now, and dragged him along to help me light the sets, or not the sets, so I'm so used to calling them sets, but their homes. This one was actually shot on a Thursday when we had the NHS clapping, and this girl is used to being semi-naked because she's kind of a nude model, but she's actually quite shy, and I had a lot of people on the streets, and she's standing by her window, and we had to do everything just very, very quickly because I wanted to include nudes. I wanted to include our local priest and just have a wide variation of different people. And at the same time, I also interviewed them as well. So there's, it's very interesting listening to their stories. For example, our father Kevin, suddenly he's used to people coming to church all the time, and suddenly he's standing in this empty church, just an iPhone on his tripod, and recording himself that he would send out to, you know, the local area. But I visited him in church, and it was just very surreal seeing him just standing there, and there was no congregation, there was just nobody there, and he's just talking to this iPhone. And I felt that I wanted to record or capture him at his own home, which is right next to the church, and looking kind of lost and worried through his window, because he said that a lot of people were already dying then, and he had to do funerals via Zoom, or very small groups of people, just immediate families, and not, you know, not large groups. And I think for him it was a very, very difficult time as a priest, and still is, to be reaching out to people, but doing it kind of through the internet, or just very much one-to-one and not as a group.
Julia,
We have some,
I just want to ask a question. With most of the work that, you know, I'm familiar with your work, as you know, I've never seen long narratives associated with the imagery. The imagery is so powerful and so strong and so dramatic. But here you're saying that you've actually were like a journalist writing what their personal stories were. And how did you interact with them whilst you were shooting, and how were you able to document, write down the story? And do you plan to, you know, at some point actually do a book that will have part of their narratives in it aside from the visual execution?
Well, I'd love to get a book published, and I'm contemplating at the moment if I need to self-publish it or if I can actually find a publisher. The way I did the interviews was I asked everybody the same 5 questions, and I emailed it to them. So it wasn't like a recorded thing. So I emailed them the same 5 questions, and then they wrote back their own text. So that was quite easy and straightforward in a way. All the preparation was done via email. Whilst I was on the shoot itself, obviously as lockdown eased, it was easier to go into people's homes and put lights through the windows. But as we had the tighter lockdown, which we have now, we can't really enter people's homes. And I'm still, like, for example, tomorrow I'm doing a shoot. I have to light everything from outside and rely on people switching on the lights in their homes, and bit by bit switching them off again because it might look better. So just experimenting with that and just relying on natural light, but helping along with my flashlighting.
Tell me, Julia, when you first started, how were you able to convince people to participate? It's such a private affair to be a part of something like this, because it's like raw meat on the table, and you're saying, stand here, the lights are going to be here, and so on. What did you pay anybody to do any of the work, or what did you promise these folks?
It's quite, no, it's, I mean, I was amazed how many people came forward. I mean, I had one image that I shot years ago as an example image of a woman, she happened to be wearing a wig, looking out of a window. And I said, I will shoot something like this. And why would you not want to have your family or you to be photographed by a professional photographer? This is your chance. So I made it very appealing for them that they will have a photograph of themselves being photographed through the window in their own homes. But you're right, it does build a lot of trust, because, you know, I have to also get model release forms and ask for their permission to be shown in various publications and in exhibitions, which has happened in the meantime. And every time there is, I didn't want to ask them for model release straight away, because it's kind of weird going to their homes and photographing them and say, okay, here's now a model release form, please sign it. So it's only when it goes into a publication, whatever, I then say, I ask for their permission and then get the release form. But everybody, most people, if they wanted to, got a print. I didn't pay anybody. Normally I do pay people, but it was also, don't forget, people were at home. They had not much to do apart from homeschooling, and those who were, many people were furloughed, still are. Suddenly their work dried up, and they had all the time in the world. And for them, it was kind of a highlight of their day, kind of. You know, me coming along with my camera with Finn, who was doing press-ups on the pavement because he was so bored, and telling me I wasn't doing things properly. I think it broke up their rhythm, because I mean, we're all getting into a boring routine now of not being able to go out. Well, we can go out, but we can't be with people. We can't, I mean, we're all here on our Zoom call, whereas normally we would be all together at the Frontline Club and having a drink together.
So, Julie, just one last thing, and we'll come back to this, because I want you to have a conversation amongst yourselves before we get to the Q&A. One of the things I'm really very, very curious, because of the crisis of the pandemic, and because none of us were prepared for it, and the kind of work that you were undertaking, which wasn't your usual work that you were doing, whether it's your personal project or advertising and so on. What do you think you've learned about yourself that you didn't know before?
You have asked me that before in an email, and I haven't given it any thought whatsoever. What have I learned? I think what I've learned of other people is more about myself rather than myself, is how the community really comes together, and people help each other out, and people are there for one another. I mean, within a week, our road had a WhatsApp group, and everybody was helping each other, you know, bringing food to those who couldn't go out, asking if everybody was okay. And we were kind of like this amazing little network helping each other. And I think that to me was incredible. And I'm feeling that obviously much wider than just our little street. I'm feeling that globally, that we're all in this together. And what I've learned about myself, I don't know. I just love taking pictures. It's probably the wrong answer. I learned that I need to continue taking pictures, and that to record something that's really important in this time in our lives, rather than staging things that I read that are historic. So this might open doors for me, or I might be more open-minded in the future to photograph more social documentary things, but more with my style of photography. I don't know if I'm really answering your question, but that's what's coming to my mind.
You answered it beautifully, Julia. It'll be very interesting to see this evolution, and, you know, maintaining your wonderful cine dramatic brand of photography, but weaving it and meshing it with topical things that are happening in the world. So I look forward to that. Fabio, so wonderful to join in today. You know, you began shooting your series in the very early days, when we were talking before of the COVID, when it was just ripping through the north of Italy, while you were working, I believe, on assignment for the New York Times. And again, I would ask, what inspired you to cover the story? How did you get access to the many images that you've created in people's homes that are stressed, frightened, families, and the stark imagery in the hospitals, given the contagion? How did you protect yourself from contracting the COVID? And also, I asked the question to you as well. What did you learn about yourself that you probably didn't know? Over to you, Fabio.
Thank you, Carol, and everybody. And thank you, Julia, for your description. And before answering your question, Carol, I just want to I'm thinking that the reason, this is the beauty of photography, because we are doing very such different kind of images, but the reason they push ourselves and what we get doing our different story is more or less the same. Just answering your last question, the sense of community, the volunteers that were trying to help each other in the little town, or the people there trying to collect food, to bring food to the people, and just helping each other in this very painful moment is something that I got back from the story. And this is how the power of photography, you know, that even if you are doing different kind of images, you need to build some kind of relation with your subject and trying to build empathy with your subject. And this is, for me, from my point of view, how photography is. Yeah, just thank you. And about the story, I start shooting on the mid of March, is a bit less than a year ago. And I remember spending the last 2 weeks of March in Italy. In February, all my projects just falls down. I was ready to go on assignment in Africa, a couple of exhibitions, and everybody being cancelled. So I spent a couple of weeks trying to arrange basically my life and my work, because it was totally unexpected situation. And in a couple of weeks, Italy just became the ground zero of the COVID-19 in worldwide. So these 2 weeks I saw, as you said, a lot of images of street pictures, a lot of images of empty spaces, the clean water in Venice. And from my point of view as a photojournalist, there were something missing. How the people are living this story and the virus, how their resilience, how they are reacting to these stories. So I got in contact with the Red Cross of a small village near Bergamo. Bergamo was the epicenter of the crisis in Italy, and it's a couple of hours driving from the city I was born, and I'm here in Turin. And I explained them the story and the reason why I'm interested to shoot the story, and they were agree with my project, and they helped me to basically to start working there. First of all, they wrote me a paper for arriving there, because the Italy were in lockdown, the first days of lockdown, so it was not possible for me to get a car and drive over there. So they start helping me from the logistic stuff until to the protection measures. So before we start shooting, we did the protocol of the measure, because in the first day we really didn't know what the virus were spreading. So the difficulties was try to not spread the virus and don't get the virus, spread the virus to the people around you. So the idea was working was depending on the environment, working in the places where the possibilities and the percentage of the virus can be high, like hospital, like houses. There were strictly measures, means full body suit, goggle, double gloves, and masks.
You have a picture of yourself in the full gear.
Yeah.
I just want to know who was photographing you whilst you were photographing the story.
So
you were in full gear, totally.
No, who did the picture? The picture was my girlfriend, that is a filmmaker, Francesca, that she was working with me. and she did a film on the first wave of COVID for several broadcasts, Al Jazeera and Arte. And she got a picture of me working just to remember. Yeah, but after that, a lot of photography, I mean, most of the photography and probably all the photographers that start working in this kind of environment use this kind of protection. So, yeah, and this was good because in the first day, also thanks for with the New York Times, we start working on the protocol measures, and this was important. And until now, I didn't contract the virus, so basically it worked. And yeah, and after that was also very important how to dress yourself, and most important, how to undress yourself, because there are a particular way to undress yourself and to sanitize all your equipment every time you get out from an house or an hospital. And yeah, so this is about the measure for not spreading the virus. And about the story, I started working with the Red Cross, means embedded with them. I was following them with my car. And, you call the Red Cross, the patient called the Red Cross, an alarm jump on the headquarters, and the car get out, the ambulance get out and just going to the house that they call. So I was following them, and the things, was that when you call a Red Cross, you are not expecting a photographer, So how the photographer get in contact with the family. So this was the most important thing of the story. Just try to get in contact with the family and explain them all the story and the reason why the story was important. To try to help in that time, not all Italian people, but all over the world, to try to understand the dangers of this invisible enemy. So the people were great, and it was such incredible courage from their side, because they perfectly know I was working for a paper for Times, and this is gonna be like published images. And they were also agree, and they also signed a press release, but more than a press release, they opened their doors to me. And the most important thing that helped me to work on this story was the time that I was working on this story, because with some of this family are still in contact, and I visit them after they recover and they're back to their works. And this is something that I think is important when you're working such intimate stories.
Agreed. Could you show us some of the images?
Oh, yeah, sure. So,
no, but it's interesting. It's wonderful to hear, the background. I don't think a lot of people really understand. They see images that are published and they don't know the backstory, what it is required to put that all together. Over to you to talk about your images, please.
Yeah. So we can just divide the story in several shooting of several different chapters. There are the images that are shot inside the house of different patients. In this frame, we can see Claudio Travelli. Claudio is a patient that they called the Red Cross on mid of March. The family called it the Red Cross because Claudio's condition was not good. He was not breathing good. It was a fever. But the family decided, according with him, to not go to the hospital that day, because the hospital during that time were saturated, and nobody know where hospital can accept you and the condition they can accept you and if they can accept you. So Claudio decided to not go to the hospital, and spend the night in his house to try to recover. But during the night, his condition got worse, and the day after, they called the ambulance again, and they bring Claudio to the hospital. After 2 swabs, was positive to COVID, and he spent 3 weeks, around 3 weeks hospitalized in a sub-intensive care. but after 3 weeks, he back home. He eventually recovered and he spent his quarantine next to his family. And after more than a month, I think probably around 1-2 months, he did the final swab test and he tested negative and he back to his work. So this is a story like with a good end, we can say, with it's a good story, but not the story was like Claudio's.
You also, I mean, you photographed in people's homes, but you also photographed in the emergency room, you know, where people were lined up on dollies in the hallways and so on. I mean, what was it like being in the hospitals and photographing there, and the sense and the tension? Can you describe it? And also, please show some of the images as well, of course. Yes.
Yeah, this is another part of the story. And my impression was, how can I say, devastating at the time. I've been working in conflict in the last decade, and I saw horrible situation in hospital too. But was in Italy, just where I was born, and working in your country without a fixer and getting all the information directly without a mediator. This is totally different way to work. You can get in contact directly with the people. And yeah, work in this environment was something that, yeah, it's normally shocked me. You know, it's an hospital in Italy is not usually like this. We can see in this image like a stretcher in the corridor of the hospital, because there were no ward or room available because there were too many patients in the hospital.
Do you know what the situation is now in that hospital? Because these were early days and you photographed this almost a year ago, March. What is the current situation with the COVID in that hospital and how they're managing what the situation is?
Yeah, this is Papa Giovanni XXIII Hospital, and this is the main hospital of Bergamo, the public main hospital of Bergamo. And I've been in this hospital several times after this picture, and the last time was less than a month ago. And I went exactly in these places, and now the hospital looks normal. The number of cases falls down, and it's, let me say, under control. I mean, it's not saturated, and they are working good now. The situation is not better at all now in that hospital, in that places. It's starting to getting better, fortunately. I mean, worse than March is difficult, you know.
I imagine. Are you covering any more stories about the COVID, or are you moving into other projects and commissions that you get? What are you currently looking at?
I've been working on COVID-19 all the 2020, and I'm still working on the story until now. I've been working mainly for the New York Times, and this was, you know, another way of work for me. I used to work as a freelancer with a lot of media publication agency, but most of the times is like that you work on the story, you close the story, and you keep going on, you know. And sometimes it's good, but in these cases was different. They keep working on this same story all over the year, seen in the same places. You know, I've been back to this hospital or other hospital several times, and this helped me to get more in contact with the people.
So it's become more of a personal project, although you're getting published, given the amount of time that you've committed to it and expanded and creating many layers of it. What would you like to be doing with it? You know, it's a massive body of work, I'm sure. I haven't, you know, even begun to scratch the surface of what, you know, what I've seen that's published. Where would you like to take this project?
Yeah, that's a good question. First of all, yeah, this project is already part of my life, because, you know, the COVID changed drastically our lives. So it's normal that it's a project that belongs to me in personal way. And I received a proposal for a book. I'm thinking about it, and probably gonna be an exhibition, but it's not sure. It's not closed yet, you know. So I keep shooting and keep working until this gonna be finished, hopefully soon. There's gonna be time to think about it.
Okay, well, I'm going to come back to that, Fabio, and hopefully when we can rendezvous again, we rendezvous for real, and we're at the Frontline Club sipping some champagne and bubbly and making our noses wriggle with pleasure. Pranvera, please organize and get the champagne chills. I know we're going to be released from jail at some point in time. Thank you so much for that, Fabio. Alys. What was your inspiration to create this series of what I think are an incredibly intimate portraits of vulnerable teenagers? When I say vulnerable, it's just because, you know, they were unable to complete their studies and their exams when they should have, and they had their proms canceled due to the COVID. And beyond that, you've approached this very differently. You know, I'm very interested why you decided to use a large format camera, a plate camera, what your challenges were in creating this series. I know that you were also you have a beautiful book, which I have, thank you very much, which you self-published. And I would love to hear the journey that you had to take along the way. And again, I'm going to ask everybody the same question. What you learned about yourself. So over to you, Alys, please. Thank you. We can't hear you, Alys.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yep, perfect.
Yeah, okay. I was just saying that's a very hard act to follow, Fabio, because they're such powerful images, and this is a very different perspective on our whole experience. So yeah, there was a lot of questions there, Carol, so I'll try and address them as I go through. Okay. But yeah, this was a project that I started in June, so not so long ago, and it ran for 12 weeks from June to August, called Lost Summer. And the reason I really started this project, like a lot of us, from March really to June, until when we were eased in terms of the lockdown, I was feeling very frustrated. I was supposed to be working on a big project for an award called the Prix Elysée in Italy, actually looking at faith and ritual and tradition. Obviously that didn't happen. I was supposed to be shooting a documentary film about a nun in Belarus. That couldn't happen. So I was feeling increasingly kind of dissatisfied. I was really missing making work, really. And kind of started thinking about how I could document this experience, not so much from my perspective, but from the perspective of a generation who were in some ways hit the hardest. And I started thinking about when I was a teenager, and proms weren't really a big deal when I was growing up. It's obviously an American export, really. But when I was a teenager, you know, when I left sixth form college, when I was 18, it was a big deal. We had all these significant events to kind of mark this very significant time in our lives in terms of growing up and leaving school and being in that kind of liminal space between childhood and adulthood. And I remember we had a yearbook and we all signed each other's shirts, and, you know, there was a leavers ball, it wasn't a prom. And I started thinking how these kids were really missing out on all of this, and how it must be such an unsettling time for them with their dreams and their hopes and their kind of aspirations and ambitions having to be reassessed and in some ways kind of stolen for them. So I started thinking about how I could document this. And first of all, I started thinking maybe I could photograph the teenagers in my block, but I didn't really have a kind of thread. What meaning would that have, really? What significance would that hold? And then I started thinking, well, maybe I could photograph young people in my neighborhood, kind of all dressed up for the prom that never happened. And this was the first photograph I took from the series, and this is Jack. And I started by, I have some friends who have kids of the kind of leaving school age. So I began to get in touch with them, see if they'd be interested in taking part. And as I said, this was the first portrait I took for the project. I kind of trundled over to my friend Viv's house, and Jack was there with his girlfriend Nancy, who also features in the project. And there wasn't really a brief as such, but I said I just wanted to photograph them in what they would have worn to the prom had it happened. So I turned up, it was a very kind of blustery day in June, and took this picture. And I kind of wanted to show really the strength and the resilience that these young kids had, but also in some ways, like you mentioned, Carol, the kind of vulnerability. And I do shoot, well, these are all shot in a similar way to my last big project, Ex Voto, on a large format film camera, plate camera. So it's a slow and considered process. And I really enjoyed getting to know each teenager, because it wasn't a quick snap. I would turn up and I would have a conversation and I'd see how they were feeling. And actually it became a kind of collaboration in some ways, an exchange between the two of us. And in a similar way to my other work, there's a kind of, hopefully a stillness and a quietness to the image that I hope comes through. And what also I was very keen to do was to not to have any casting or any styling. So it became often a kind of word of mouth thing. So I would photograph one teenager, they would then recommend their friends. I also had friends who were teachers at schools and state schools in the local area, and they would begin to put things in their newsletters and people would get in touch with me, but I never kind of selected who I would and wouldn't photograph. And I never knew, often I didn't know what they would look like until I actually turned up. And then I had to think very carefully about how I would really frame this and contextualize their experience. So I actually initially thought about photographing them in their bedrooms. And at this point, well, at the beginning of the project, it was kind of friends of friends, but I was very keen to obviously get a diverse mix of teenagers, because I do live in North London. It's a very diverse neighbourhood. And I felt that if I photographed them in the bedrooms, in some ways, as a viewer, you would perhaps begin to make judgments about their socioeconomic status, their background, their families. Did they live in a big house? Did they live in a small council flat? And I didn't really want that to be a part of the project. So that's the reason I decided to photograph them in these very kind of open and democratic spaces. And often these are the spaces that we all really relied on, you know, during lockdown, these tiny pockets of open spaces. So I ended up photographing them. If they had gardens, I would photograph them in their gardens. If they didn't have gardens, I'd photograph them in their backyards, or sometimes just the car park of their block of flats or their local parks. So I kind of used the natural landscape as a frame, really, and that kind of became my studio. So you have the leaves and you have the walls and you have the trees and all these elements of the natural landscape kind of framed in portraits. And I think what I was trying to do really was to try and, in a similar way to my other portraits from my project Ex Voto, what I'm always trying to do is really merge the kind of inner world and the psychology of the person I'm photographing and bring some emotion out in that way with the outer worlds. So I think in some, like Fabian, this is Fabian, he's kind of a bit more theatrical than the others. And then you have someone like Samuel, who I just loved, and I loved how he appeared in this kind of oversized bow tie. Like, I just adored him and I loved his style. And he's got a kind of sense of perhaps apprehension to him. But I wasn't really directing the photographs in a very kind of strong way. I wanted them to really come through each teenager as an individual, and there to be a real sense of kind of loss in some ways, but also a longing. So a loss in terms of their summer, you know, their summers had been taken away from them. They weren't seeing friends. A lot of them were stuck in their bedroom for weeks on end, but also a kind of longing for the future, because actually what I was really struck by was how incredibly kind of strong and resilient a lot of these teenagers were, and how they very much were still set on their future, whether it was going to university, or whether, you know, Alfie studying science at university, or whether it was David is going to teach, wants to teach kids graphic design in Ghana. They all had these kind of hopes and dreams, and I wanted to try and capture that as well. That was very important to me.
Can I stop you there for a second?
Yeah.
Because you've made some really important points, and you know, I'm quite, as you know, I'm quite familiar with the images, and the thing that strikes me about them is the timelessness, and not just because you're using a plate camera and so on. They're straightforward imagery, but there's a diversity in what they're wearing, how they look. It's not quite dating, you know. It isn't like saying, oh, that was shot during 1954, or it was, and so on. There's something very timeless about it. And very quiet. all of them, none of them are laughing. You didn't pose them to, smile at the camera, the usual kind of a thing. But with your book, the narratives that you were just talking about, you hadn't put them into the book. And I love the book because it's just simple, the simplicity and the elegance of just having the portraits and the visual expression. What do you, I mean, do you think someone picking up this book in 2 decades would know that was shot during the COVID?
I mean, I don't know. I think part of the reason I work in black and white is that there is a simplicity and a purity and a timelessness to it. I don't pretend that's not a reason I work in it. And certainly with previous work, I like that there's an element of not knowing the era it's been shot in. And that's very appealing to me. And I think a lot of my influences in terms of photography are more kind of traditional photographers who've shot in black and white. So for me, almost colour for this project would be almost too much of a distraction. I mean, I hope that their kind of strength of character comes through and that you start beginning to kind of create stories around each individual. So yes, there is a sense of timelessness to it. But in terms of the book, I mean, it is very timely, obviously, as a project, but it's also a history of a particular moment in time. And I hope that it kind of serves as a way to express what this particular generation was going through at this incredibly difficult moment. And that's also why in the book it's incredibly kind of simple and simple in design. And I thought about using quotes from each of the teenagers I photographed, and The Guardian ran a story and they did use some of the quotes, but actually in the book I wanted it to be very much focused on each individual portrait. So there's a poem by Walt Whitman at the beginning called Continuities, and then it ends on a poem that Ruth wrote here. So when I met Ruth, she actually lives in kind of a very quite deprived area of London in a teeny tiny flat with a quite large family. But when I spoke to her, she really is a lover of poetry and she writes her own poems. So I asked her if she would be prepared to write something about her experience of the pandemic. And so Ruth Ann's poem ends the book, and she's written something very kind of beautiful and touching and moving.
It's really lovely. Can we come back to the question that I ask everybody during the process of creating this series of pictures? Did you learn anything about yourself that you didn't know before?
I think probably the biggest, not lesson I learned exactly, but the biggest thing I learned was that I don't have to rely on traveling to kind of new cultures and new locations and far-flung places to find a story, if you like. Like, it was actually really lovely for me to rediscover an area that I thought was so familiar to myself. So I've lived in the same flat in the same area for nearly 15 years in London now, and I thought I knew every corner of it. And actually traveling to the homes of these, or not the homes, but the outdoor spaces of these kids and teenagers, I was walking there, I was on my own. I just had my suitcase with my large format camera in, my tripod, kind of trekking there, and I got to know the neighbourhoods in a different way, and I got to notice things. Like, I think, you know, part of the result of this lockdown is we're normally so busy, kind of head down, heading to the tube, going into town, whatever we're doing. And actually, I noticed the simpler things in life and in my neighbourhood. And that was an aspect of it I really enjoyed. And I ended up going to, like kind of pockets and corners of the neighbourhood that I hadn't discovered before. So that was a real kind of joy for me, along with meeting the teenagers who I just admire so much. Like, I just thought how they were handling it, you know, even though the kind of ennui had set in and they were listless and they were bored to a certain extent, they were still very much able to kind of adapt to this situation. So that showed me, it gave me a lot of kind of hope for the future, actually. And I really wanted to create a body of work that was positive in a sense, because I think also teenagers in London often get such negative press very unfairly. And I wanted to do something that was really kind of for them as well.
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful summary, that it shows hope and promise, and that's a wonderful, you know, if nothing else, it's a gift that you've allowed to express through the book and the picture that you've taken. Thank you for that, Alys. Ismail, I'm going to move on to you, viewers. We're beginning to run a bit short on time. This can go on for hours, and I would really be enjoying it. during the past year, whilst the COVID pandemic has raged, you covered, as I said earlier, another type of pandemic, racial discrimination, which came to a head with the killing of George Floyd. Can you share with us about what it was like to cover the protest in US, what you witnessed, managing your own safety, not just with the protest, but also with the virus spreading, and what your challenges were? I'm curious as why did you focus on this very specific story and what you also have learned about yourself? Over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Carol. So I'll start with the story because everything happened so fast last year in March that, and being in New York City was quite a lot to take in. Overnight, everything was changing so fast, and our life was changing. I mean, I was supposed to come to Frontline Club as my first London trip on the 29th of March, 2020. And I had my flight on 23rd of March, and New York City went to shutdown on the 16th of March. And, all the border were closing at that time, European Union cut down flights between United States. But because of Brexit, United Kingdom was not part of it. So it was like a confusion, shall I fly or not? What is the intensity of the virus? It was really, everything was very uncertain. And definitely the day I was supposed to fly, I canceled my flight. But the most interesting part, I would say, I've been seeing my friends or colleagues are photographing, documenting the COVID-19 coverage. So I was also thinking of some ideas. I was speaking with National Geographic magazine to work on some projects. How could you, it's a completely different measure we have to take, the safety measure. And now you cannot be around people, people just hiding from people on the street. New York is like that. I mean, mask was not mandatory or or not worn at that time. New York or America started wearing masks in, I think, mid-April, 20th of April, something like that. But even yeah, it was such a bizarre, unreal moment to live in New York City. And on the 27th, I myself couldn't smell my coffee in the morning, and I realized that I got COVID. So, and I was every day past, I was running every day at that time. I couldn't run more than, I was running 5K almost every day, and then I couldn't run more than 1K or 2K. And I was every day I was deteriorating, and I was not sure the day I couldn't smell my coffee, I'm okay. And there's no safe, there's no solution. I called my PC, primary care doctor. She didn't pick up the phone. Then I found out that she was also sick from COVID. So anyway, so I'm starting because I'll be showing. Can you see my screen? 1 second. I'll be talking and sharing.
Excellent.
Can you guys see my screen?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, excellent.
At least I can now. Tell us about these pictures.
Yeah. So then all my all my travel got canceled. I was sick myself. I had to go to hospital one night, because I couldn't breathe. Long story short, but my life was confined in few blocks in Manhattan where I live. And the only way, so the picture I was taking every day was quarantining or recovering. And I was just walking around blocks every day. I would walk for 20 minutes or half an hour, and I will have my camera, and I just photograph New York City, my daily life, And then you see all of a sudden people wearing all these masks in the street, which was didn't exist our face covering didn't exist like 10 days before. So, or like here's like my neighbor, she is doing her Pilates class, and she's improvised with her can of beans, like as a weight. You know, she was doing first time ever a Zoom Pilates class. So like how our life has changed because of COVID. It was like drastic. Like, and New York was the epicenter. You know, I mean, like Fabio was saying about Italy. It's like Italy and New York's kind of like competing. Like people, I was getting phone calls from all around the world. You know, so here like they're doing first time antibody test in New York City. And then like people hanging out in the park, like socially distant, wearing masks, you know. I mean, these are like so bizarre, like didn't exist like, you know, before. Like she was, so New York City claps still now actually, it's funny, like every day 7 p.m. to thank the health workers and essential workers. So like someone like my neighbors like clapping at 7 p.m. From our window. He's a doorman in my building who had COVID as well, so he just came back after recovery. So the way I photographed like my daily life was like how our life has changed because of COVID. And then my recovery was long, and I started feeling better end of May. And actually around that time, the Black Lives Matter movement started. I mean, because of George Floyd killing. So, you know, it was kind of refreshing for me as a photographer, because I have not seen, I mean, I photographed like Trump protest and women march, but like in that scale, nothing ever I have seen in America, like in my experience. And like even like, you know, the protest was like everywhere. New York City was also kind of epicenter of like protest, but it was fascinating, and a lot of experience I had from the protest, because like you will see like 5,000 people all of a sudden, you don't see anyone in the street, and all of a sudden you see like 5,000 people on the street gathering for protesting, but everyone is wearing masks, you know. So it was also like quite like how responsible people were at the same time, or while they're protesting. I mean, this is fascinating. Like the small things I really pay attention to it as a photographer. Like this guy, he didn't want to disclose his name. That's why he's kind of like, you know, covering his face with his sign. And he is, I think, 82 years old. He is 82 years old, from Harlem. And this sign he's been carrying since the civil rights movement, the same sign. He goes to every protest with the same sign since the 60s.
Wow.
This is the this is our courthouse in downtown New York. Yeah, and
did you ever feel, you know, during the protests and, you know, and the crowds and the mob scene, did you ever feel, you know, threatened? You know, obviously you always have your camera, and I think sometimes with a camera, once you pick it up, you know, if you're using one that you're bringing it up to your face, you forget danger. That at least I do anyhow. The most important thing is how I'm framing a picture, and is the light correct, and my so on. And it isn't until you bring the camera down that you realize there's a lion ready to bite the back of your neck. So I'm just wondering, when you've been in some of these, you know, some of the protests and so on, did you ever personally feel that you were in danger, that you were in harm's way?
Well, I never felt danger by the protesters. Rather, I'd feel danger by the police. So NYPD, yeah. So like how they were charging us, like even as a press, it was insane. I mean, on the second day of the protest, like, I mean, the whole New York City was like it's a mayhem. It was unbelievable. Like I was walking with the protest, and then all of a sudden there's like cars burning, police car are in fire, and then like they didn't like, you know, consider like press uh, as a neutral position. Like they also like, you know, beaten or like charged. And
can I stop you there? Because this is really, really, really important. And you know what the Frontline Club is all about, I'm sure, you know, in London. And it is, you know, the press is always, the most important thing is, you know, they're there to tell the truth. They're there to show what the facts are and what's happening. And historically, it used to be you had a press card and you wore a press badge, as we have in the field. And even if you were in the middle of a war zone, you know, the two enemies and the two opposing people were not going to take you out. And here you are in the US, in a democracy, in New York City, and you were being challenged, if not threatened, that the police weren't showing respect because you were a journalist. Do I have that?
yeah, I mean, it was quite hard to, like, you know, take in for me, because I'm from Bangladesh, and like, you know, like we get a lot of, I mean, it's free press. In Bangladesh, we don't have free press. So like, you know, before I moved to America, I always had a dream, oh, it's gonna be like such a free press country. And honestly, like last 4 years of Trump, it was really hard to be a photojournalist or photographer in America. Especially like I you know, I did a lot of like road trip last year, went to like 24 states, and the like if you go to Deep America, the way they portray New York Times or like, you know, or like liberal media, they're like enemies. So I couldn't even say myself like I'm a photojournalist. Like always had to say like I'm a photographer. Like because when a lot of the times I had to face racism. That's a different story. But yeah, it was quite. I mean, like even like in November, I was photographing a protest of black transgender in downtown Manhattan. And the police was just like blocking my camera in front of me, and I'm trying to like make a frame, and he will be like just like, you know, blocking me with his body, and I'm like, hey, and then he'll like he'll be pushing me, just like intimidating you so they can arrest you. So like one of my friends, actually, he's the New York Times photojournalist, Amr. He got arrested in Chinatown last year. Well, he was photographing NYPD arresting someone. So it was really tense, actually, as a photographer or journalist last 4 years. I'm looking forward to, like, you know, new time in America with Biden. So I hope for the best, but like, you know, last 4 years, I think it was not very comfortable as a photojournalist, you know.
That's a tragedy, but in spite of that, Ismail, some of your imagery, and I've been looking at a lot of it, and I'm looking forward to meeting you as well. It's stunning. So in spite of Trumpism and so on, you've been able to capture and communicate some absolutely exquisite imagery. And also, I find some of your pictures, you know, you weren't born in the US. You come from another kind of a world, and what your eye was able to see and what you witnessed is there's so much truth in the imagery, and I keep revisiting some of your pictures because I learn something more every time I revisit the picture. We're getting close to running out of time, and I would love to have a dialogue, a conversation amongst all of you, instead of me, you know, kind of directing things. Would anybody like to ask a question of the other panelists, please? Anybody? Oh, Fabio, come on, help me out, would you?
So, okay, I'm gonna question for Julia. I don't know if she can told us, but before she told, she did 5 questions, the same question to all the people she portrayed. And if you can tell us 1 or 2 or 3 or 5 questions that you ask them.
Yeah. Sorry, I kept disappearing. There's a problem with my internet. So if I get cut off, then I'm not just running away. As far as I remember, it was something like, how has COVID affected you? What have you learned from the situation with COVID? Who do you live with? And what is generally your situation? So it's quite broad in a way, but everybody had so many different stories to tell. For example, this young girl, Bethan, who was studying to be a doctor, was suddenly, it was all sped up and she had to go to hospital, and she passed her degree, she qualified, and now she was thrown in to be a doctor with like months before she was really ready, because she had to be, they needed her in the NHS because everybody was understaffed and they had to put her kind of on the front line, so to speak. So it was really interesting to hear each individual stories, you know, like with the priest, like I mentioned earlier, and people who, you know, everybody had different stories. Like those, some were hardly affected, like our family. I live with my husband, my 2 kids, but we're homeschooling. That was tough because we didn't have any help from the teachers at all. Other people were more affected because they lived by themselves. They didn't have much contact with anybody, like physical contact. And the whole world is suddenly on the internet, and I'm seeing that happening with my kids. It's very, very hard because everybody's kind of in this kind of computer zone, which is hard to get out of. But I think generally, I mean, London, it's been tough, but I don't think it's been as tough as in other places like New York and Italy. And I see, because I don't go behind the scenes and see what's happening in the hospitals, but yeah, I really take my hat off to you guys who captured all of that and put yourself in the forefront of it all, and kind of risking your lives as well, because if you get COVID, you don't really know what's going to happen to you. Anyway, yeah, I'm blabbing, so I'll shut up.
You know, Ismail.
Thank you very much, Julia. Thank you.
You said you had the COVID. Would you like to ask any questions? You know, because I think it's really interesting, tonight's talk is that there's 4 different stories that you're all telling, and experiences, and approaching it in 4 very different ways, which I find fascinating totally. So Fabio, you now transported, living in New York City, the Big Apple. Do you live in Brooklyn? Where do you live, Fabio?
I live in I mean, I used to live in Manhattan. I just moved to Brooklyn recently.
My daughter. Yeah. The reason I say is my daughter lives in Brooklyn as well, and she's a journalist.
Cool.
She's a writer rather than her mummy, who is a snapper. Anyhow, would you like to ask? You know, you guys. I don't think you guys have met before, and would you like to ask? You know, Fabio or Alice or Julia any question?
Yeah, I'm curious about Fabio. Like, you know, yeah, I think you mentioned a little. First of all, like, amazing work, definitely, like, really inspiring. Like, you know, no, it's like your work was fascinating. I mean, like, actually moving and really inspiring to show the world. You know, and actually, you know, your picture was posted by Disturb in New York City.
Yeah.
So also, you know, Benjamin Petit from Disturb, we're pasting actually your picture together. I think it was in June or July, in Lower East Side. But my question, like, you covered like conflict zone a lot, like around the world, and then you added a little bit, like, you know, photographing in your own country. How did it feel actually? Like, I mean, like, I myself, and when I photographed refugee crises around the world, and then when I covered in my own country the Rohingya refugees, the experience was very different. And I felt like so much close to this story. So I would like to know, like, what's your experience, you know, as an Italian photographer photographing your own region or hometown.
Thank you, Ismail.
Fabio, excuse me. There's a request while you talk, so you can show us more of your pictures.
Oh, sure.
So can you share your screen and keep talking and keep showing the pictures, please?
Sure.
Thank you, Pranvira. I love you.
So, yeah, work in my country, first of all, as I said before, working without fixer, Ismail, without the people that is always in the middle between you and the other people, helped me to get more in contact. And this was the good side. And the terrible side was that I was never waiting that something like this can happen worldwide, and never been thinking that Italy can be the first place in this side of the war. And you know, when you are shooting, basically the camera makes like a filter between your realities. So you are inside the situation. This helps you to document this reality, you know? But when you are coming back, and when you spend your time watching the images on your laptop, all the power of the motion just get out from the screen, you know? And this is something that happened after all the year shooting in Italy on COVID. Yeah, and it was like difficult for me to do not see everything around me in with this point of view. For example, when the Italy region is divided in colors, and the yellow colors means you can get out and you can meet people until 6 p.m. blah blah. And even when it becomes yellow, you know, meeting with my friend or going to get a coffee in the bar just was for me like more difficult, you know, because in the same country, just few weeks before, even in November, was a totally different situation. You know, I needed the time to just to you know, put everything in their spaces. So this was working in Italy, and this is something that happened when you're coming back on conflict in other place. But you know when it's gonna come, and it's perfectly understandable because it's totally different environment, you know. So when we are in conflict and you back home, you already know that it's different. And inside you and your mind is focalized on this different and understand it better. But when the same thing happens in your country, you are living this thing, and just few weeks later you are need and trying to live like your normality, your daily life was something that, oh, well, you know, and I needed time to understand it better.
Fabio, could you show us more
I just want to add a little, sorry, because it's a very important question. Like, because you have to go back again and again to your pictures when you're editing, right? When you're editing down. Did you feel emotional going through the pictures? Like, because the situation you photographed, it was not translated by sometimes you don't have to translate with words, but like, it's not translated by a fixer, because you are talking to them directly. And when you're looking back in your computer, those pictures you have taken, like the dire situation you have been through, like, you know, like the pictures I'm seeing here. Did you feel like any like emotional, like, did you have a flashback or, and the second question is, will it change the way of you work in the future, like how you used to and how you will work in the future, covering stories, not only in Italy, but around the world? Sorry, long question, but I think it's, I want to hear.
Can you click through the, Fabio, can you click through the images?
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you. So answer the first question, definitely when I'm watching the images after a while, or when you are easily, that's depend of the way of working and the kind of work and the environment you are. But definitely when you are watching the images working on the edit of the story, and this also happened when I've been working on The Dream, the book that I did, just the images that just come back to you with the power of the frame, and you are probably just living again the same situation that we're living when you are shooting. But when you are shooting, you are totally thinking about the reason you are there, you know, try to think about the picture and, you know, all the story. And definitely when you are watching the images and when you come back home, the power of the frame come back to me. This always happen, like, yeah, since 2010.
Alys,
And the second was, if this is gonna be change my way of working, basically, I don't know. I mean, I think this is the only way to work that I know, and this, you know, and the way I've been working like 2-3 years ago, 4 years ago, I think that is the same way of working now with more consciousness and with, you know, probably different feelings sometimes, different relation, but the way that I work is always the same. Try to get in contact with the people and try to build some kind of empathy, even for 10 minutes, you know. It just can be like how you approach to the people, how you shake your hands, yeah, how you see the eyes of the people you're gonna get a picture. And this kind of way, and you know when you get out the camera or you don't get a camera, don't get a picture, and you use a lot of frame, and you know the way working. And it's the same way that I approach when I shoot in, you know, refugees or frontline with the rebels or COVID patient or family. The way that I put in the story is the way that I feel comfortable, and I hopefully feel people comfortable. And it's the same way. If this work that I did gonna change the way I develop the projects, this can help probably.
Mm-hmm. Alys, do you have any questions for any of the panelists?
I was interested, Ismail, in your work, being kind of immersed in the Black Lives Matter streets of the US. It's had so much media coverage, and what impact do you feel, maybe it's too early to say, but what impact do you feel particularly the photographic coverage of Black Lives Matter might have on instigating, you know, real and long-lasting change?
It's an interesting question. I mean, what's impact? I think, I mean, it was one of the longest protests I have ever covered, or like I've seen the media have been covered. Like, I mean, New York protests lasted about 100 days or more than 100 days, and then in Portland, Oregon, Portland, it's lasted, I think, more than that. And the pictures, it's interesting. Like the pictures came from these protests. Like they're like before I moved to America. They're like, I've seen pictures from Baltimore, Ferguson, but like these protest pictures, I think, has some sort of significance that which was like a lot of the times compared the time of civil rights movement, and it was so I think because of also social media coverage, like how pictures been spreaded, I think it has some sort of like created the accountability. Like even like how like how the law enforcement and like the government reacted on that. So did you ask about my, I'd just like to clarify, like, do you ask about my image or like in general, like the photographers?
Well, kind of, well, yours, but also in general in terms of, you know, how much impact the media has in actually instigating, you know, real change in terms of
I need to raise my hand here because we're all having such a good time, and I'm sorry not all here sipping wine alone, which is really ridiculous when we can all be at the Frontline Club sipping champagne, which would even be better. But we've really run over a tremendous amount. And I have to say, this has been one of the best funs I've had in so long. And it's been the highlight, I have to say, of our last lockdown and so on. And to hear all the stories. And the thing I have to tell you, as soon as this lockdown comes down a bit, we must all come to the Frontline Club. You all can come to London and visit, and we would be happy to welcome you here. And Ismail, my daughter, I told you, lives in New York. When I come to New York, I'm going to come and see you as well. When I go to Italy, I want some of that very fine Italian wine and fields, and we'll have a bit of fun, Fabio. And of course, Alys and my beautiful Julia, who I know very, very well. Just as a short thing, Julia and Alys are very close friends of mine. I know them a very long time. And Alys and I graduated, I know I'm a little bit older than Alys, about a lot older than Alys, at university in photography in 2020 and so on. This has been an amazing talk. I want to thank you all. I want to thank everyone who's tuned in with this, and Panvera at the Frontline Club, a co-founder of it, who sets up the most amazing talks. And if you're not familiar with the Frontline Club, I really suggest everyone that is tuned in right now, please do go online, learn about the Frontline. They are amazing. I've been privileged to be a member for the last 10 years, and nothing is more joyful than going to the Frontline, having one of their talks and one of their events. Their restaurant is to die for. I have to tell you, it's seriously wonderful. And the club room is very Hemingway-esque and boots on. And you can see sometimes people coming back from a war zone or whatever, and their equipment thrown on the floor and mud on the floor. So it's a wonderful place to come. I'm delighted that the Frontline invited me to be a part of this series, which is focusing on the still image, which, like Alys said, in terms of black and white photography, there's something about revisiting it and so on. This series is going to occur every first Thursday of every month, and the next one is going to be on the 4th of March. That's GM time of 1900, which is 7 o'clock for those that don't work on 24-hour clocks. And the theme for the next talk will be the most influential photos ever taken. Please watch for the trailers on the Frontline Club or clicked into their website to attend. Admission is seriously free, which I think is amazing that Frontline is providing all this service. And to thank you all panelists. It's been so wonderful to have you a part of this program tonight. And I look forward to seeing you. I've been sipping wine alone. My ice is melted down to 0. So it's only diluted so I can see so enough to chat with all of you. And thank you everyone that has tuned in today. We're very grateful for your support. It means a great deal to us in these very difficult times, just to get people to listen and hear our stories and for us to connect with one another is so important. Thank you all and good night.
Thank you, Carol. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Panvera, thank you for organizing everything.
Yes,
You are the
Panvera.
star.
Ciao.